It was the kind of cold that didn't just settle into the skin, it burrowed. The winter of 1896 came early to rural Pennsylvania, wrapping the pine-covered hills in a damp fog that rolled in like smoke and clung to every stone and shingle of St. Benedict's Abbey. The air was too still, the clouds too low, and the silence too complete. For most of the year, the Abbey stood in a shroud of quiet routine, prayer, labor, obedience, the kind of silence that comforts because it's chosen. But on the night of December 17th, the silence turned. It became something to watch, something holding its breath. And then, at precisely midnight, the bells rang. One toll, then a second, then a third. 11 in total. 12, then nothing. And from that night onwards, the bells of St. Benedict's would never ring again. The villagers at the base of the hill heard it, not just the ringing but the stop. They were used to the schedule, the rhythmic clang that marked every quarter hour, the deep, resonant midnight chime that had rung for more than 50 years without fail. But after that night, the tower was silent. Some said it was the ropes. Others whispered it was the clapper, fallen and rusted, but no repairman was summoned, no explanation offered. The abbey gates remained closed, the monks unseen. And then the deaths began. Quietly at first, without announcement or burial bells. Just word passed through the butcher, the postman, and the old woman who cleaned linen for the monks. Brother Tomlin was found face down in the orchard, stiff and blue beneath a frost-bitten blanket of pears. Brother Elwin slipped down the cloister stairs, though his skull, cracked open in a perfect circle, didn't match the jagged iron edge of the rail. The other 3 deaths came faster. One in the library, slumped over a prayer book with eyes wide open. One in the bath, drowned with no water in the lungs. One, the Skonom, the youngest, simply vanished. Inside the abbey, no death rites were held. No formal notices were sent to the diocesan office. The remaining brothers, those still walking the dark corridors, did so with heads lowered and mouths shut. Their days were spent in the chapel, unmoving, unspeaking, kneeling long after the candles burnt out. At night, none of them slept in their beds. Instead, they lay on the stone floor in the refectory, wrapped in the same sheets they had once folded for guests, whispering silent prayers that didn't follow any known liturgy. Their meals went untouched, the bread molded, the water soured. Something had shifted inside the abbey, and those who had once lived by silence now feared it. The bell tower loomed above them all, a hollow giant with an open mouth that no longer sang. Some said the silence was mechanical, that the pulleys had frozen in the frost. But others knew better. The bell had rung perfectly at midnight, 12 clean, thunderous tolls, and not a single one before or after. It was not the bell that broke, something else did, and whatever had been held back by its ringing was no longer bound. The townspeople grew nervous. Those who passed near the abbey claimed to hear something moving behind the gates, not footsteps, something softer. The shifting of weight, the scrape of stone against stone. Dogs refused to walk the road past the southern wall. Birds circled but never landed on the steeple. The air carried a strange scent, copper, wax, and something else, something that burnt the nostrils like old medicine or dried teeth. But worst of all was the feeling, that crawling, skin-tight feeling of being watched through glass. No one knew who had rung the bell that night. No monk confessed, and yet none denied it either. By the 5th day, winter had set in for good. Snow masked the gardens, buried the statue of Saint Benedict to his knees, and sealed the abbey in a white silence thicker than the fog that came before. But inside, beneath that snow-covered roof, something had already taken root. A quiet that wasn't peace, a presence that filled every space where sound should be. And though no one would speak it aloud, the truth pressed against the walls like rising water. Someone had opened something, and it would not be closed again. But the most haunting part wasn't the deaths or the silence or even the absence of confession. It was the certainty among the remaining brothers. The way they moved, spoke, and breathed, as if they believed they deserved it. Whatever had come, they had let it in, or worse, invited it. Brother Callum was the kind of man no one ever truly noticed, and that was exactly how he preferred it. His world was ink and order, lists and ledgers, the daily breath of the abbey committed to quiet, perfect memory. He was not a preacher, not a singer, not a teacher. He was a keeper of records, and in his mind the act of recording was sacred. Names were more than names, dates were anchors. He believed God saw everything. But it was men like him who preserved the shape of what was seen. For 29 years, his small quarters beside the archive never changed. The walls were lined with wood shelves, each packed edge to edge with hand-labeled scrolls and books. The inkwell on his desk was always full. The quill is always clean. His cot was always untouched during daylight hours. He recorded everything. When bread was baked, when the lambs were born, when the wind shifted, and when a monk failed to speak at morning mass. He believed silence had texture, and that was what made his death so loud. They found him the morning after the third body, his door closed but unlatched, the faint scent of wax spilling from the gap beneath it. His room was still warm even from a dozen candles burning low in staggered brass holders. The wax had poured onto the desk and floor, fusing the corners of his ledgers shut. The walls were untouched, the air heavy. Brother Callum sat upright in his chair, hands resting on the table, as if mid-prayer. But his chest was motionless, his eyes open. There was no blood, no bruising, just a kind of stillness too complete to be natural. His face held no fear, only surprise. Before his heart had stopped, it seemed he had been trying to write. But there was no parchment beneath his hand, no quill in his grip. Just the slab of his oak writing desk, stained with warm wax and the tip of a single finger scorched into its surface. At the center of the desk, the wax had pooled into a thick oval, smooth and reflective. And within that hardened dome were strange grooves, lines, indentations, like letters pressed into it before it cooled, not carved, not etched, written. The marks formed 6 words. They were crude but clear. Each letter is slightly off-center, as though shaped by fingertip rather than pen. It read, "He waits where the ink runs dry." The inkwell beside it was filled, but the quill beside it had been split down the shaft, rendering it useless. No one could explain it. No one spoke of it. The wax was scraped. The desk was removed. The body was buried without a hymn. But something had started, a new kind of record, one not kept in books, but in silence, in heat, and in things meant to vanish. Before he was Brother Ulrich, he was simply Elias Drummond, a municipal exterminator with an eye for patterns and a silence that unnerved his co-workers. He didn't speak unless asked and never smiled, never hurried. But he logged every trap he set with perfect detail, date, bait type, angle of placement, even weather conditions. For most, pest control was a job of disposal. For him, it became a form of observation. He recorded how the rats reacted to different poisons, how long they struggled before stillness, and how their final positions often mirrored one another when left undisturbed. There was nothing outwardly violent about him. He didn't seem to take pleasure in pain. But he noticed things no one else did, things no one else would think to see. He joined the Abbey in the spring of 1884, claiming to seek penance for a life spent in filth. But what he truly sought was solitude and space. Space to continue his work under the cover of piety. At St. Benedict's, he took the name Ulrich, a nod to an old bishop who died of plague. The other monks saw him as disciplined, even gentle. He spent long hours in the lower cellars, keeping them free of pests with unnatural efficiency. The bodies he collected, rodents, birds, insects, he burnt or buried as expected, but only after examining them in a small room beneath the eastern stairwell that no one else entered. He catalogued his findings in small notebooks bound with waxed thread, not by species but by behavior, reactions to poison, duration of death, post-mortem twitching. He believed suffering told stories, and he wanted to read them all. When the bell tower went silent, Brother Ulrich became more withdrawn. His eyes lingered longer on the flickering candles. He hummed when alone, but only between midnight and dawn. When asked about the sudden deaths, he offered no theories, only said that the cycle had begun, and cycles once started must complete themselves. His fingers, always clean, now showed signs of staining. Dark crescents under the nails, as if he'd been working with ink or something thicker. Then one night, Brother Jeremy, the youngest of the monks, stumbled across Ulrich in the garden shed. He wasn't tending to plants. He was crouched over something small and limp, whispering as he peeled back its skin with the careful motion of a man removing gloves. The next morning, Jeremy requested a transfer to another abbey. His request was denied, and he was never seen again. Ulrich continued his work in silence. The cellars stayed clean. No rats, no birds, not even spiders in the corners. But the walls began to smell faintly of something bitter. The kind of smell that makes the tongue dry and the eyes water. No one spoke of it. But some began to wonder if Brother Ulrich had come to the abbey to escape sin, or to feed it under a different name. It was the cold that reached them first. The rehearsal chamber, normally sealed only by habit, had been bolted shut from the inside. No one had noticed it missing from the morning rotation, not until a novice failed to show for kitchen duty and another for confession. Brother Matthias was the one who broke down the door, splintering the old oak frame with a crowbar pulled from the tool wall. What they found inside stopped the abbey. Not just the breath or the voices, but the rhythm of the place. Time itself seemed to falter. 3 boys were seated on the long rehearsal bench, robes pressed, collars straight, and mouths moving. There was no sound at first, just the open shape of a hymn being mouthed in unison. Then came the faint, trembling hum, so soft it seemed to come from beneath the floor. It was the hymn of mourning, a melody reserved for funerals and plague processions, never taught to the youngest and never performed indoors. But the boys were humming it, teeth clenched, eyes stitched shut with fine black thread, horsehair, pulled tight, piercing lids and skin and brow, one thread per face, looping over and through, a cruel, deliberate seam across innocence. 2 of them were already dead. Their lips were blue, their limbs bent at unnatural angles as if they'd been arranged post-mortem. Yet their bodies still sat upright, propped maybe, or braced. The third boy, Thomas, only 15, was alive but barely. His back had been broken in 2 places, one leg twisted beneath him, and his hands blistered as if he'd crawled across the stone floor for hours. And still he hummed, mouth shaking with the rhythm, blood dry at the corners of his lips. When they tried to lift him, he screamed through clenched teeth. Not from pain, but from panic, as if something was still watching, and the song was his only shield. The room held no sign of forced entry, no weapon, no footprints. The window was locked from within. The candles had burnt to stumps, pooled into a perfect ring around the boys. A circle of wax no larger than a baptismal font. The hymn books were untouched, their pages clean. But one had been opened, and pressed between its spine was a single strip of cured leather, dry, yellowed, and not animal. Humans, a thin layer wide enough to write on. And someone had. The words were faint, almost etched rather than inked. The eyes see sin, the voice must guide. Investigators from the church came in silence, their cassocks brushing the floor like slow wings. They took photos, drew diagrams, but none of them returned after that week. The boy, Thomas, was taken to the infirmary. He lived 6 days more, never speaking, never seeing. He hummed until his throat cracked and his lungs collapsed. On his final night, the nurse swore she heard him whisper one word. Not Latin, not a name, just a number, 13. The chamber was sealed. But in the weeks that followed, other monks claimed to hear the faint drone of voices from behind the door. Never loud, never angry, just 3 soft hums, rising and falling, always in harmony, always in the key of grief. The altar at St. Benedict's was built from thick black walnut, older than the abbey itself. Its corners had softened over time, worn down by the hands of decades of brothers who knelt, prayed, and wept before it. It had seen communion, confession, and death, but what it held inside had never been touched, not even by those who worshipped inches above it. The drawer beneath the altar was locked with a rusted iron mechanism older than memory. No monk had the key or claim to, and for years it was simply assumed to be decorative, a remnant of an earlier chapel, sealed with time and left untouched out of respect. But respect gave way to necessity when the deaths could no longer be ignored. A police inspector from Pittsburgh, summoned by quiet desperation, broke the lock with a chisel and a whispered prayer. What he pulled from that drawer was not a Bible, not a relic, but something hand-bound and pulsing with silence. 23 pages sewn at the spine with coarse black thread, cut in uneven shapes and edges that curled slightly with age. They were not parchment, not animal hide. They were human. Cured skin, stretched and tanned and pressed into a book too warm for the room. The ink was dark, thick, and slightly raised, as if carved rather than written. And the words were Latin but not scripture, oaths, vows, devotions. Some were variations of monastic vows twisted into unfamiliar forms. Where a typical brother pledged poverty, these pages demanded sacrifice. Where obedience was once a virtue, it became submission of the senses. Lines repeated across the pages in growing boldness. The body is the altar. Sight is betrayal. Blood speaks when the tongue is sealed. Each page was more graphic than the last. Some included crude diagrams, A human skull with holes drilled at measured intervals, a hand bound in wire, a mouth stitched in a spiral instead of a line. Others included lists, dates, and the word complete marked beside several names. All of them were names of monks now dead. At the center of the book was a folded slip of cloth stained with something that had soaked through and hardened like glue. It wasn't immediately identifiable, but under the right light, faint lines of ink became visible. Scripture again, but this time a passage from the book of Job, reversed and reworded. It read, "For I was not born to see, but to serve that which sees me." On the next page, pressed flat against the surface, was a fingerprint in dried blood. Not smudged or partial, but perfect, as if someone had stamped it with care, not in a moment of violence, but as a signature. Forensics could never determine how many skins had been used. Some pages showed hair follicles, others still held faint birthmarks or the raised traces of veins. It was not haphazard. The skin had been cleaned, treated, and inked with a skill that suggested practice. Not haste, not impulse, but method, belief. The ink itself was later tested and found to contain iron, bone ash, and something else, something unidentifiable but organic. Flesh turned into a covenant. The killer hadn't just broken doctrine, he had written his own. One that required silence, obedience, and the destruction of natural senses. A theology of mutilation. The book was taken as evidence, but no official record of it exists. It disappeared in transit to the diocese's vault. The officer assigned to transport it never returned to duty. His house was later found abandoned, all windows sealed with wax, and a note pinned to his kitchen wall with a small sharpened bone. The note said only, "The vow was accepted." Since then, no one has entered the altar's drawer again. The lock was replaced and the drawer resealed. But those who pass near it say the wood smells wrong. Not rotten, not old, just warm. Like something inside is still drying, still waiting to be read again. For nearly 4 days, the grand chapel of St. Benedict's remained lit without interruption. No monk admitted to tending the candles. No oil was delivered. Yet the flames burnt steadily in every sconce, every lantern, every taper that lined the marble floor. Not flickering, not dimming, just unwavering light that never seemed to need feeding. The illumination was total but unnatural. It cast no warmth, no smell, and worst of all, no shadows. The walls remained flat and undisturbed even as figures passed between flame and stone. No silhouettes, no outlines, just light against emptiness. At first the monks whispered of miracles, but that faded quickly, because the light wasn't comforting. It revealed nothing. It exposed everything. And soon, those who stood in it too long began to feel a slow nausea, as if their bodies were being seen by something that didn't blink. The chapel had always been a place of ritual. Its vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows had stood unchanged since the foundation was poured. The pews were carved by hand. The altar was brought from overseas. The crucifix above it is rumored to be older than the church itself. But this light turned all of it unfamiliar. The paintings on the ceiling looked different, not in detail but in mood. The cherubs' faces twisted slightly when viewed from different angles. The lambs in the mural of the Good Shepherd bore teeth, and the eyes of saints no longer met the gaze of the viewer. They looked past, or down, toward the floor, toward the bones. It was Brother Lorien who first noticed the candlesticks. Tall, ornate, gold-framed columns that had once held pure beeswax. Now each one was filled with something coarse and gray, soft to the eye but jagged beneath the surface. What looked like ash was ground bone. Humans, hundreds of fragments packed tightly into each holder, shaped to mimic wicks with a fine dust that clung to the inner rims. It was not the result of cremation. These bones had not been burnt. They had been crushed, deliberately, carefully, and without tool marks. Finger-sized fragments compressed into powder. When investigators examined the residue, they found traces of vertebrae, knuckle joints, and what was confirmed to be a portion of a jaw, still bearing a molar wrapped in dried sinew. None of the candlesticks bore fingerprints, not even partials. The outer brass was wiped clean, but beneath the bone dust embedded into the grooves of the base were microscopic fibers. Hair, cloth, something biological, likely placed before the wax holders were filled. The monks stopped entering the chapel. Services were held in the refectory. Prayer rotated outdoors under thick wool blankets. But the chapel remained lit, night and day. Its stained glass windows glowed orange at midnight. Its pews remained empty. No one heard footsteps, but the door would sometimes creak as if being opened from within, though it never moved. Some began to say the light was not light at all, but something wearing its shape. Something that burnt, not to warm or to guide, but to cleanse, to sterilize, to bleach every surface until only the bones remained. A monk assigned to the night watch collapsed outside the chapel door, weeping and blind, claiming he had seen the walls open like ribs and something crawl through them without breath. The candles finally went out on the 5th day, all at once. No smoke, no embers, just instant darkness that lingered like soot. When the chapel was entered again, every candlestick had returned to its previous state. Beeswax restored, wicks clean. The bone dust is gone. The investigators requested photographs from the previous days, but no images survived. The negatives had overexposed themselves, showing only a featureless white where the light had been. The chapel was closed indefinitely, not for restoration, not for ritual cleansing, but because no one could explain what had happened, and even worse, no one could prove it had happened at all. In the winter of 1896, just days after the deaths began and the bell at St. Benedict's fell silent, an aging man stepped forward. His name was Abram Yarrow, the last living blacksmith of his line, once known for his work in architectural iron and the sacred bells of rural Pennsylvania. He was nearly blind, hands twisted from arthritis, but his mind was sharp with details only a craftsman could remember. He had heard the news of the deaths in the papers, of the vanished sound that once marked midnight, and when he read the name of the abbey, something surfaced, a memory not buried, but waiting, one he had tried to forget for more than 50 years. In the spring of 1842, Yarrow had been in his prime, young, strong, respected. His forge was known from Pittsburgh to Lancaster, not for weapons, but for purity of tone. Bells that sang like voices, warm and long and full of life. He had forged cathedral bells, town clocks, and even funeral chimes. But the commission from St. Benedict's was different. It came not from the church, but from a solitary monk in gray robes who gave no name. The man arrived on foot, carrying a slip of folded paper and a small satchel of dull, reddish ore. He asked for a bell that would not echo, not simply a bell with a short range or muffled tone, but one whose sound would die the moment it left the metal. A chime that left no trail, no reverberation, no memory in air or ear. Yarrow had never received such a request. Bells were made to carry, to call the living, to mark the hour, to praise or to mourn. But the monk insisted calmly and without pause. He claimed it was for a place of silence, a place where echoes invited things that should remain buried. He said the metal must be pure, the shape exact, and the alloy mixed without sulfur. When asked about payment, the monk produced a small gold coin, older than anything Yarrow had seen, stamped with a face worn flat and characters in a language he couldn't place. He kept the coin, not for value, but for the weight it carried. It felt wrong, cold even in a firelight. But Yarrow took the job. For weeks he worked the forge alone, melting and casting with the provided ore, mixing it with iron and nickel in a ratio that didn't feel right. The resulting metal cooled too quickly. It resisted polish. The bell that emerged was smooth but dense, with a strange, dull finish that drank light rather than reflecting it. When he first struck it with the hammer, it rang, once clearly, and then the sound fell dead, absorbed into the air like it had never existed. No echo, no bounce, just a brief note swallowed by silence. Yarrow described the sound as beautiful but sad, not haunting, more like a sound that wanted to be forgotten. The monk returned exactly when he said he would. He carried no cart, no horse, just a padded cloth and rope. He lifted the bell without strain, thanked Yarrow in a language the blacksmith still cannot name, and walked away. Yarrow never saw him again. He told no one about the work, not even his wife. Not until the bells at St. Benedict's stopped ringing and something inside him stirred. The newspaper photo showed the tower. He recognized the shape, the exact curve he had poured, the silence that followed. He came forward quietly, not to accuse but to unburden. And in doing so, he introduced a new theory. That the silence in that abbey was not born from failure but design. That someone decades earlier had forged the death of sound into the very metal that crowned the building. A bell that would never allow a cry for help. A chime that could only ring once. And that the man who ordered it had known what silence would be needed long before anyone else had reason to be afraid. The garden behind the eastern wing of St. Benedict's had long been overgrown, hidden behind rusted latticework and a patch of forgotten hedges that no one had tended in years. It wasn't part of the main grounds. Not anymore. The soil had gone pale, the trees brittle, the vines wrapping the old stonework as if trying to pull it into the earth. Some said the garden had once been used for herbs and prayer, a place where the sick were brought to recover and breathe the sweet balm of lavender and sage. But by 1896, the air back there was dry, sharp, and strangely still. Even the wind seemed to avoid it. It was Brother Cedric who first discovered what lay beneath. He'd wandered in search of silence, hoping to escape the chapel's light, the smell of old wax, and the humming that still crept from behind locked doors. He found instead a patch of dirt that resisted every step, not soft, not hollow, but stubborn, like walking on stone wrapped in skin. Digging revealed something too neat to be accidental. The first bird they uncovered was a dove, its body pressed flat as if it had been laid beneath a press and frozen in place. No feathers scattered, no broken bones jutting outward, just perfectly flattened tissue as if the entire creature had been compressed evenly, without tearing, without crushing. The second was a thrush, then a crow, then more, dozens, each spaced evenly apart, each no more than half an inch thick, each missing its eyes. The sockets had been cleanly scooped, not torn, and the cuts were not made by claws or scavengers. They were circular, surgical, as though someone had taken great care not to damage anything except the one thing that sees. The unearthed birds were preserved better than they should have been. The soil had been treated, possibly with salt, maybe lime, maybe something else. Something that allowed the bodies to keep their shape even as time tried to reclaim them. But the most disturbing part wasn't in the ground. It was in the shed nearby, locked behind a door, hidden beneath an old hanging vine. Inside were shelves, 10 in total, each lined with jars of preserved liquid. Suspended in the thick amber fluid were eyes. Bird eyes, still intact, still watching. Some belonged to robins, others to owls. One jar held 27 small black beads labeled only by species. Each lid was sealed with wax and marked in red wax pencil with a date and a number. The most recent match was the last snowfall before the bells stopped ringing. No one could explain how the birds had been flattened. No visible trauma. No machinery on the grounds is capable of such precision. The weights would have needed to be wide enough to compress without breaking and heavy enough to kill without spilling blood. It wasn't messy. It was a method, the kind of controlled violence that requires rehearsal, thought, purpose, and behind it a principle. Something learnt and applied over time, like a formula refined by obsession. Later investigation found an old page tucked behind the lowest shelf in the shed, barely legible. A hand-drawn diagram showed a series of tiered plates descending on a single axis. At the bottom, a simple line of text in Latin. "Only what you see may scream." The monks were told to stay clear of the garden. The soil was raked and the jars removed. But none of it felt like removal. It felt like a disruption, as if they had interfered with something already complete. And after that, the birds stopped coming. No chirps at morning bell, no nests in the eaves. The sky above the abbey grew quiet. Even the crows that used to circle the steeple disappeared, as if drawn somewhere deeper, somewhere underneath. Some believed the garden was a message, not to the monks, but to something else. A sign left in silence, a warning made from flesh. A ritual where vision was punished and sound erased, layer by layer, until even the wind forgot how to carry it. He was the youngest left among them. Novice Benedict, 17, pale and newly shorn with the kind of soft voice that trembled even in prayer. He had arrived at St. Benedict's just 9 months before the bell fell silent, full of hunger for solitude and stillness, unaware that silence in the wrong place could rot through a soul like wet stone. After the 3rd death, his appetite vanished. After the 7th, his sleep fractured. And by the 10th, the boy stopped speaking altogether, at least while awake. At night, something else took over. He would begin to tremble in his cot, not violently, but rhythmically, like a ticking clock too close to breaking. His mouth would move without breath. And then the words came, not in English, not even in proper Latin, but in a dialect older than the church itself, guttural, slow, and wrong. Witnesses described it as slurred scripture, as though something was trying to imitate the sound of religion without understanding it. He spoke of a figure that came only in dreams. Not a man, not a ghost, but something walking between both, a presence he called Vir manus tacitus. The man with quiet hands, a shape that made no sound when it moved, cast no shadow when it passed the firelight, and left no scent in rooms it had filled. The novice described him as faceless, though not because his face was hidden, but because no part of him stayed still long enough to be seen. Like trying to remember the details of a scream you only heard once in childhood. The boy would whisper during these episodes that this man was always near the door but never entered, watching as he slept, watching as the others forgot how to. One night, Brother Emmerich sat beside Benedict to transcribe what he heard. What he recorded still sits locked in diocesan archives, redacted by hand. The boy described a ritual of erasure, something called the dimming, a slow step-by-step unmaking of self. First the voice, then the memory of one's own name, then the warmth of breath, then at last the ability to hear anything at all. In this dream, the boy said, the man's hand would rest against the novice's chest, not to cause pain but to still the heart. Not stop it, just silence it, slow enough to forget what it had once felt for. The boy would wake soaked in sweat, mouth dry, fingers clenched so tight they bled into his blanket. And yet he never remembered any of it. Doctors were summoned from the city. They diagnosed the episodes as seizures caused by stress, claiming Latin emerged only because of his monastic environment. But none of them explained why the Latin he spoke included terms no longer taught, grammar from a dialect extinct for centuries, or scriptural phrases that mirrored banned texts locked in Rome's vaults. When questioned, Benedict returned to silence, his eyes wide and watery, as if any word he spoke might call something forward. Something is still listening. It wasn't just what he said. It was what changed in the room when he said it. The temperature dropped. The candles bent their flames sideways without wind. The floorboards creaked under no weight. And more than once the ink from transcribers' pens bled down the page in crooked lines as though pulled toward something beneath the table. The man he spoke of was never seen, but others began to feel him. A sense of movement in mirrors, a breath behind their ears, a tap on the shoulder that revealed no one. The monks began to refer to it only in whispers, manus tacitus, afraid even the name might bring the silence closer. Then one morning Benedict was gone. His cot was still warm, the sheets folded neatly, his slippers placed beside the bed. The only thing left behind was a strip of paper tucked beneath his pillow, torn from an old hymnal. On it was a phrase written in a slow, careful hand. He sees what should not echo. From that day on, no novice ever stayed in the eastern wing past nightfall. No one opened the hymnals unless required. And the name that had once been whispered became something even more dangerous. A memory the monks tried not to share, because by then they understood. Some things don't take your life. They take the sound of it. And you never know you're missing until the silence starts looking back. They were never meant to be found. The wall had stood undisturbed for over 50 years, tucked behind rows of sleeping cots in the eastern dormitory, its plaster long darkened by time and breath and the sweat of restless nights. The renovation was ordered only after a section of wood began to sag near the corner window, warped by a winter of heavy rains. The workers hired from outside the monastic order pried open the inner panel expecting rot, maybe old wiring, maybe forgotten brick. What they found instead was a hollow lined with dustless stone and packed with small, neatly arranged objects, 23 wax figures, each roughly the size of a fist, sculpted in quiet detail. They were not crude. They were not toys. They were effigies, human forms posed with folded hands or open mouths or arched backs as if frozen mid-suffering. Each one held within it something organic. Teeth, embedded like ornaments into the wax torsos. Nail clippings arranged as spines or ribs. Strands of human hair pressed along the crown or twisted into cords around the limbs. The materials had been inserted while the wax was still warm, molded into shape with patient hands. No two were identical. Each figure seemed tailored, posed in a way that mirrored the actual position in which its real-life counterpart had been found. One wax figure sat with its legs drawn up and arms bound across the chest. The body of Brother Elwyn had been discovered in a nearly identical position beneath the cloister stairs. Another was molded with a cracked spine and bent neck, matching the fatal fall of Brother Tomlin. There was even one with its mouth wide open but the tongue missing, a clear reflection of novice Benedict, whose body was never recovered but whose silence had been the most feared of all. What unsettled investigators wasn't just the accuracy. It was the system behind it, a logic so precise that it felt less like madness and more like belief. On the back of each figure was a symbol, not a letter but a carved mark, shallow and simple, a single vertical line, sometimes doubled, sometimes crossed. Some believed they were numbers. Others thought they were progress marks, steps in a ritual meant to record not just death but transformation. And near the farthest corner of the compartment, a small scroll was found, so brittle it nearly dissolved when touched. But beneath the smudged ink, 3 words remained legible. Formam servavit animam. The form preserves the soul. This wasn't the work of a killer in a frenzy. This was a method, deliberate, symbolic, and chillingly patient. The wax was not commercial. It bore traces of animal fat, resin, and something darker, later revealed to contain blood, traces matching unknown male DNA. The wax was flesh-colored, but not uniformly. Some figures bore different tones, slight grays and yellows and purples, like bruises remembered in sculpture. None of the monks could explain who had made them. But deep down, most had already guessed. These were not warnings. They were relics, offerings. Each one was meant to hold something inside, not just a representation of the dead, but a placeholder, a vault, a binding. The figures were removed, catalogued, and locked away. But in the nights that followed, those who had touched them reported strange symptoms. Sudden nosebleeds, ringing in the ears, dreams of being watched from corners they couldn't turn to see. One worker refused to return, claiming he woke every morning with wax beneath his fingernails. And for the monks who remained, the most haunting realization came not from what had been built, but what might still be missing. There were 23 figures, but the final death count had since risen to 24. It was meant to be a formality. Brother Harrow had been dead for over 6 months, buried in consecrated ground just beyond the orchard wall. His grave marked with a simple stone and a verse from the Book of Psalms etched by a trembling hand. But when new evidence came forward, a fragment of correspondence unsigned referencing a hollow throat and deaf ear, the decision was made to exhume his remains. The dig was done at dawn, under frost-heavy trees and with no witnesses beyond 2 officials from the diocese and a physician assigned to oversee. The coffin was intact, the wood swollen but not split. But when the lid was pried open, the silence that met them wasn't just stillness. It was a presence, heavy and unblinking, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath. Brother Harrow's body had not decayed in the way it should have. The skin was waxy and unusually preserved, as if something had been used to dry it from within. His jaw was clamped shut, and his eyes, though sunken, bore no sign of clouding. The physician began his examination, expecting brittle bone and slow collapse, but what he found instead rewrote every assumption they had left about the nature of the deaths. The larynx had been removed, not crushed, not rotted, but cleanly extracted. In its place sat a tiny carved insert, cylindrical and smooth, shaped with such precision it resembled surgical tubing. It was made of wood, polished to a sheen and fitted with etched rings along the side, markings not unlike those found on organ pipes. Where the cochlea should have been in both ears, identical replicas had been installed, also wooden, shaped like the spiral shell of a snail, but sealed at the end, incapable of transmitting sound. The replacements were not symbolic, they were anatomical, designed to mimic the original organs in shape, but not in function. They did not transmit sound. They did not allow speech. They sat in the body like placeholders, like seals. The physician was shaken. This wasn't mutilation. It was replication, a perversion of medical reconstruction with a purpose too methodical to be dismissed as madness. It was as if someone had believed that true silence didn't come from death, but from erasure, a ritual silencing that began from within the body itself. Traces of a dark resin were found around the wooden implants. When tested, the resin revealed compounds found in both varnish and natural anesthetics. Whoever performed the procedure had prepared the area carefully. There were no signs of struggle, no torn ligaments, no panic carved into the muscle. This hadn't been done post-mortem. Brother Harrow had been alive when it began. And if the anesthesia had worked as designed, he may have even remained conscious, aware, awake, and unable to scream. What disturbed the church more than the act itself was the implication that someone among them had the knowledge to perform such a procedure with clinical precision. Anatomy at this level required study, practice, equipment, and belief. A belief that removing a man's ability to hear and speak wasn't punishment but salvation. That silence wasn't a symptom of death. It was a gift, and it had to be given carefully. The coffin was resealed, but the damage was done. Rumors spread quickly. Some monks claimed they had awoken to the sensation of pressure in their throats. Others swore they heard wood creaking from inside the chapel at night, not from the beams, but from something smaller, something waiting to be carved, something already shaped like them. In the weeks that followed, no one stood too long in front of the mirror, because it wasn't just about silence anymore. It was about what might already be inside. In 1934, nearly 4 decades after the last midnight bell of St. Benedict's, a university research team visited the abbey under the guise of architectural preservation. The true reason remained hidden in coded correspondence between the head investigator and a private funder in Berlin. Both men obsessed with the relationship between sound, obedience, and neurological decay. They weren't there to study the stonework or the scripture. They came for the bell. The original casting still hung in the tower, untouched since 1896, its iron alloy dark with age, its surface smooth but strangely dull. as if it had absorbed more than weather. The bell had not rung in 38 years, but its final toll had been documented in the monastery's own records. A clean, sustained chime that lasted exactly 13 seconds before cutting off without echo. The researchers wanted to know why. And more dangerously, they wanted to know what that sound had done. They used early audio analysis equipment, bulky, slow, and crude by today's standards, and brought with them a wax cylinder recording believed to be the only surviving audio from the Abbey's tower that year. At first, it seemed like noise, a long, low metallic hum with no melody. But when running through a frequency separation process, something emerged beneath it, a subharmonic, too low for human ears to detect naturally, but strong enough to affect the body. The frequency was measured at 17.4 hertz, known today as the frequency of disorientation. The same range is used in modern experiments to induce nausea, anxiety, and visual distortion. At the time, it was only beginning to be understood. But even then, the lead researcher wrote that the sound made him feel like his thoughts didn't belong to him. Like something was leaning over his shoulder, humming just behind the bone. Further analysis revealed patterns layered inside the tone. Not words, not music, but a shape, a waveform that matched known brainwave suppression signatures observed in studies of hypnosis. The frequency had not been created by accident. It had been designed, built into the bell's very shape, forged into the curve of its mouth and the depth of its alloy. A sound that didn't simply mark time but bent it, bent the will. The monks who heard it in that final midnight moment may not have known what was being done to them. But something had entered them. Not as a thought, but as a command stripped of language, an instruction that bypassed choice. The bell, it seemed, had been the first sermon, and its tone was not a call to worship. It was a tool of control, one that made the body still, one that quieted resistance. The researchers, skeptical at first, began to fear what they had unearthed. One man exposed to the frequency for more than 3 minutes during playback suffered a seizure. Another lost hearing in his left ear for an entire week but swore he could still feel the sound behind his eye. The head investigator noted in his private log that every man present that day dreamed the same thing that night. A tall figure standing just outside their field of vision, motionless, humming without moving its mouth. They abandoned the project within the month. The church denied access to the tower soon after. The bell was ordered sealed and the wax cylinder disappeared. But rumors lingered that the tone had been used before, long before the Abbey. That it came from ancient structures where sound was not a signal but a sentence, that certain chants, when recited in the right cadence, produced similar brainwave shifts. The line between ritual and rhythm blurred, between voice and vibration. Faith, the investigators had come to believe, was not just a belief system. It was a structure. And like any structure, it could be engineered. The monks hadn't just been victims, they had been shaped. In the years that followed, more was written about the bell, but nothing was proven. The tower remained locked, but some nights just before the hour, wind sweeping through the trees outside the old abbey takes on a tone. Not quite music, not quite voice. A pressure in the chest, a warmth behind the eyes, and those who feel it never forget it. because it doesn't ask for faith, it simply removes the space where doubt once lived. In 1957, during a quiet reorganization of diocesan archives in Philadelphia, a set of misfiled census documents was uncovered. They were routine at first glance, lists of clergy assignments, birth records, death notices. The paper browned with age, but the ink was still legible. What drew attention wasn't what was listed, but what wasn't. The year in question was 1896, the year the bells of St. Benedict's went silent. According to the official record, 27 monks had lived within the abbey walls at the time. Yet internal monastery journals from that same period referred to 28. At first it was dismissed as a clerical error, but the name of the missing monk surfaced again and again, threaded quietly through work logs, prayer rotations, and food rations. Brother Silas, no last name, no origin, no assignment history, no baptismal record, just a name repeated in handwriting that remained steady across 2 decades of documents. Investigators cross-checked every page he appeared on. In delivery manifests, he signed for crates of materials no one recalled ordering. Glass cylinders, copper wire, resin, crushed mineral pigment, and strips of treated hide. In repair logs, he documented structural maintenance no one remembered requesting. And in private theological journals scribbled in margins or added as notes, his presence took shape through annotation. Short phrases written in Latin that matched no known translation, brief corrections to scripture, and redacted hymns with entire verses crossed out and replaced. No photograph existed. No one remembered where he had trained or when he had arrived. And yet his handwriting, clean, sharp, slanted forward, was everywhere. As though the abbey had been shaped more by his pen than by any prayer. The deeper they searched, the stranger it became. Some of the records where his name appeared hadn't been signed at all, until recently. Faint handwriting in the margins had developed over time, as if added after decades of aging. A forensic specialist brought in reluctantly by the church concluded that some of the ink used to sign Brother Silas was no more than a few years old. It was as if the name kept writing itself. One monk, still living in a care home at the time, was shown the documents. He was 91, one of the last who had lived through the final years of the abbey's decline. When asked about Brother Silas, his lips tightened. He didn't deny the name. He denied the question. He said no such man existed. But when handed a page from the Abbey's 1896 meal log, he traced his finger along the edge, then stopped. He tapped once on the bottom row, a line without a name, just a number. 13, the same number spoken by the novice who dreamed in Latin. The same number that had appeared in the margins of the wax ledger. The same number that reappeared again and again, carved beneath pews, stitched into robes, scrawled behind altar cloths. Always faint, always hidden, always just enough. What the investigators feared most wasn't that a monk had been forgotten. It was that he had never been recorded at all. That someone had lived, worked, and performed rituals inside holy ground without the church's knowledge. Or worse, with their quiet consent. Some began to wonder if Brother Silas was a man at all, or if he was a role passed down, a mask worn by many, a function, an echo, a hand that never left ink on the quill but always left it on the page. The church closed the investigation quietly, burnt the recovered documents, and sealed the abbey records indefinitely. But the handwriting remained. even after cleaning, even after time. Because some names don't need to be remembered. They just need to be written over and over and until they are believed. They sealed the bell tower in 1901. Iron bars welded across the inner stairwell, a layer of brick and plaster set into the only access door, thick enough to forget. The bell itself was left untouched, suspended in place like an open mouth frozen mid-breath. Above the archway, a bronze plaque was mounted, simple, somber, unmarked by any church symbol. It read only, "In silence, we remember." The monks still prayed below it, but never aloud. They passed the tower without looking up. Children were told never to speak near it, as if sound itself could stir something inside. Over time, ivy grew across the bricks. Dust settled into the corners. The history faded into legend and then into discomfort. The kind people don't talk about but never truly forget. The abbey slowly emptied. The last few brothers left in the 1920s, their names erased from rosters that had once been obsessively kept. Eventually, only the structure remained, a hollow of stone and silence on a hill the town no longer claimed. But the bell was never silent. Not completely. Every 10 years, always on the winter solstice, a child in the nearby town would wake in the night, walk to the window and say they'd heard a sound. A single bell tolls, low and distant, coming from the hills just past the orchard line, always at midnight, always only once. Each child was under the age of 10. None had ever been to the abbey. And each one, without fail, fell asleep moments later, still sitting upright, eyes closed before they could speak another word. They never remembered it in the morning, but their parents did. The reports were scattered at first, dismissed as dreams, stories, or rural superstition, until patterns emerged. 10-year cycles, same date, same hour, same silence after. In 1961, a historian from the State University gathered records of the phenomenon. He found that every child who had heard the bell on solstice night shared the same birthmark. A faint crescent on the inside of the left wrist, barely visible, like a scar that had never fully healed. The mark matched an etching found on the underside of the original bell's interior, a carving thought to be a mistake during the pour. A half-moon surrounded by 13 notches, the same number repeated throughout the abbey's hidden records. The same number was found beneath the wax ledger, on the paper in the novice's room, and on the wall behind the pulpit. The number that never stopped showing up. No matter how many times it was erased, no investigation into the bell tower has ever been reopened. The church maintains that the seal is symbolic, that no sound could emerge from a bell suspended in disuse for over a century. But the toll is heard, still, always by children, always alone, as if the sound waits for ears that are still clean. Minds are still soft enough to shape. It doesn't call the faithful anymore. It is called the quiet. And when it does, it never calls again. Not until the next solstice, the next cycle, the next echo reaching forward from something that was never buried, only hidden. What remains of the abbey is now fenced off. The foundation is cracked, the walls damp with time. But the tower stands unbroken, tall against the sky, as if still listening. The plaque below it is faded now, its letters worn. But some nights, if you stand close and speak too loudly, the wind seems to pause, as if waiting for you to finish. Because silence never forgets. It just learns to wait. And what began with a single toll might not have ended, only passed on, quietly. patiently, until it finds the next voice to hold.